Alrighty, well, welcome back to another episode of Both Sides Now. This week we're very privileged to be in Auckland with Sir John Key. So welcome, Sir John, to the podcast.
Thank you.
So the first question we start every podcast with is, what political ideology or philosophy would you say you identify with?
Well, I suppose as a philosophy, I am conservative from an economic perspective, and probably interestingly for a conservative MP, former MP, I'm socially liberal. So I've kind of always believed that you need to make your way in the world. Less government's better than more. Giving people the opportunities to change their lives and improve them. Sort of that freedom principle. But I believe you've got to balance the books ultimately, because if you don't, another generation of in this case, New Zealanders has to pay for that. But I sort of grew up with an Austrian mother, brought up, largely by her, and she was very liberal. And so you wouldn't be able to argue I'm religious. So I don't on religious grounds, so I can't go and argue, these things. So I voted pretty much for every liberal thing you can ever imagine in Parliament, from euthanasia to gay marriage.
So on that point of balancing the books, obviously the GFC was a massive part of your term as Prime Minister. How do you compare the economic situation we're facing now with that of the GFC?
Yeah, so the GFC, I think one thing that was interesting about that was that you had, if you want to think of the world in a three-legged stool basis, China/Asia being one leg of the stool, the United States, and then Europe the third one, you had problems in the US and Europe through the GFC because of the banking crisis. China was in quite a different place probably than it is today. Its balance sheet was strong, it was growing, it had the capacity to take the world out of the GFC. So in that regard, it was different. Today, when we look at it, everyone's been affected by COVID, and in fact the Chinese have taken a much more rigid approach to COVID, and it's actually economically costing them for now. So they haven't been they've in fact slowed the global economy down because of their supply chain issues and everything else. So that's been one difference. Recently, just a little bit more recently, you've had inflation coming back, which we haven't seen for 30 years probably. So it's been a little bit different, but in the end the principles are still the same.
Do you subscribe to the theory of trickle-down economics?
I do. I mean, I guess on the basis that, I kind of a massive believer in the multiplier effect. So I think that if someone spends some money, that gets spent everywhere, and numerous times in the economy. And I do think that ultimately, what is good for, it's not a win-lose situation, it can be a win-win situation. So let's just argue for a moment, corporates are doing well, then ultimately that has all sorts of implications for individuals and therefore is good. So I think, a rising tide lifts all boats. The question is whether it lifts them all fast enough as well.
Nationals often mentioned as the party of economic growth. I guess I have the notion that we can't grow indefinitely on a planet with finite resources. The definition I was sort of first taught of economics is the study of how we allocate scarce resources more efficiently. Do you think we've possibly got it wrong in that we've focused so heavily on growth in business and politics and not so much on economic efficiency increases?
Look, I think it's a challenge. You're right. I mean, you're fundamentally right about the allocation of scarce resources. And I think in a country that's been relatively wealthy for a long period of time, like New Zealand, we always have had a bit of a mind for, the impact of those resources on the economy. I'll come back to climate change in a minute, because that's possibly slightly different. But if you think about the others, we for a long time have sought to have very high levels, for instance, of renewable energy. Again, we've been pretty conscious of things like, the state of our waterways or the state of airways and things. So I think as a general rule, I don't think they have to be either or. I think as you become a wealthier economy, typically you try and balance both. And it's a sort of I'd obviously disagree with, some on the left sort of believe that, you trash your economy and that's how you get wealthier, trash your environment, should I say. But actually, if you look at it, poor countries tend to trash their environment. Wealthier countries try and grow actually through balancing those two objectives.
Mm-hmm. On the reallocation of resources, there was a Stuff report that says the top 1% wealthiest Kiwis pay an effective marginal tax rate of 12%, and the average Kiwi pays an effective marginal tax rate of 17%. Is there any way around that inequality other than a capital gains tax?
Yeah, I mean, I don't sort of subscribe to those numbers. I think like anything, numbers are an interesting thing. Politicians use them when they suit them. They don't when they don't, you know.
Yeah, but even if you don't agree with those numbers, there are some Kiwis who pay a very low effective marginal tax rate just because they have most of their income coming from assets, right?
Assets,
So some really wealthy Kiwis don't pay a lower effective marginal tax rate. Than
so that's right. So I mean, if you then sort of strip those numbers down and say who's actually paying the amount of tax, the vast bulk of tax is paid by better off New Zealanders and bigger companies. Like take ANZ, okay? You know, people will sit around all the time and say, oh, ANZ as a bank makes $2 billion in profit. That's true. We're also the largest corporate taxpayer in the country, have been for very, very many years. So in nominal terms, you can probably find a business that you might be able to argue pays a slightly higher tax rate than we do, although we pretty much pay the statutory rate. We don't look for any kind of unusual deductions. But in nominal terms, we're paying huge amounts. And so if you take Graham Hart, no, I don't know Graham's finances, but he's got a big gazillion of assets. So let's assume those assets have all risen and he's in that point that you're making, looks like a low effective marginal tax rate. His actual taxes that he's probably paying are probably 5,000 times the equivalent of some of the people you're talking about. And so it does become one of those arguments about how much is enough and how much, what would it take to stop them being there. Now, that's quite a different issue from capital gains tax. I haven't been a great fan of capital gains taxes, and the main reason is that they're a highly inefficient tax. So they're a realisation tax. You've got to sell something, and if you don't sell it, you don't pay it.
Yeah.
Most countries in the world, in fact, I can't think of one that has the family home in there. The vast bulk of housing in New Zealand is the family home. If you look at it, like take the Commissioner of Inland Revenue in New Zealand, she has been opposed to capital gains taxes because she says around the world they're highly inefficient. So I guess what I'd sort of say to you is that it's horses for courses. If you wanted to put everything in there, I'm a supporter, and I mean literally everything. I mean the family home through to the car you buy. But countries don't do that, and so in the end they don't work very well.
Yeah, I guess taking the capital gains argument out of it, to some extent we do have a regressive tax system for some individuals compared to some. Surely no one, everyone agrees that it's fair that everyone should at least be taxed the same percentage of their.
Yeah, so I don't agree. I don't agree with that.
Right.
So if you look at working for families means that effectively for huge numbers of New Zealand families they pay zero tax. Okay, so in fact that's not regressive, and it's like GST. I mean, when we lifted GST as a government, people argued, oh, it was regressive. If you pay 1 cent more for a loaf of bread because you're a student versus what I pay as a company director, that 1 cent's more important to you. But in fact, in nominal terms, I pay so much more. So the point is, I think if you look at, we have a progressive tax system with relatively few deductions actually compared to say the United States and these other countries. So what I do worry about effective marginal tax rates, and where you do see high effective marginal tax rates are as people transition out of things like working for families into a normal tax environment. So their paid income is taxed quite heavily because they're losing the government subsidised income.
Yeah, no, I would agree that overall the system's progressive, but my personal view is that some parts of the system are regressive just because we have a lot of individuals who are earning a huge proportion of their income from asset.
Yeah, and so like I said, it's sort of horses for courses. I mean, my old economic advisor, he came out of the Treasury and brilliant guy, and his view was, yep, there should be a capital gains tax in New Zealand, but it's just got to be on absolutely everything. Yeah, right. And if you're prepared to put it on everything, because I mean, for instance, say I go and buy myself a piece of art and it's a McCann, and I pay $1 million for it. In 3 years' time, it's worth $3 million. Are you going to tax me on it?
Yeah.
Because if my intention wasn't to resell it, it was to hang it on the wall. Then actually under its intent rules in New Zealand and under IRD, I shouldn't be paying tax on it. But actually, I'd argue with I should, because I've only got that $1 million because I've got enough assets to be able to afford a luxury piece of very appreciating expensive New Zealand art. And that's our problem. I mean, people look at very simple things. And I mean, with companies, I mean, there is a really strong argument. And Sam Morgan used to make this argument that, well, I didn't get taxed when I sold Trade Me. I did sort of point out to him, if you wanted to send us $50 million, you could feel free to, and we'd happily take it off him. But it's tough because on the other side of the coin, do you want people to create companies and create entrepreneurism, and lots of them go broke and all this kind of stuff? But all I'd sort of say to you, if in the world that we have to live in the sort of a world that's efficient, and as a tax system, it's not highly efficient unless it's everything. But if it was everything, I hate to say it because I'm not a massive probably believer, but if you took Roger Douglas's view of the world of flat tax, right? There's actually an argument Roger was right, which was tax everything that moves at 15% or something. Problem with that is the left of politics will always say one day, like very quickly, like in day 2, oh, it's still not fair because Graham Hart's still paying 15% on his $5 million income or whatever their number is. And so they don't like that. And so pretty quickly they get back to raising rates.
I'd agree with that.
So if you want to put on everything at a flat rate, I'm probably with you. Yeah.
So just changing lanes slightly,
Yep.
I guess back to national. It's no secret that you and Chris Luxon are good mates.
Yep.
What do you see in him that you think would make him the next Prime Minister of New Zealand?
Well, first I hope he is the next Prime Minister of New Zealand, so Finn might disagree with me, but I'm a massive supporter. Look, Chris has got an unusual, somewhat unusual combination. First, he comes with a really strong business background, and that's not always that common in Parliament. I came from, running big parts of Merrill Lynch and things, and that was great, but I was sort of unusual as well. I mean, there's just not that many of them. So he's a proven CEO, did a fantastic job with Air New Zealand, tremendous job with Unilever. Secondly, he's got a prodigious work rate. So the guy, reads and, studies all these things, I think he's got a very good feel actually for everyday New Zealanders. He's worked with big workforces. It was very popular, for instance, at Air New Zealand. I think he's got a sense of where he wants the country to be in 5 or 10 years. So it's not just about getting the job, it's actually, because like anything, any Prime Minister is judged ultimately by did they leave the country in better shape than they found it. So when I was Prime Minister, one of the really big things that we were on about was far less about actually, lift this tax rate, lower that. I mean, yes, people focus on those things, but it was, could we make New Zealand more confident and more ambitious and more outward looking? That was our perspective. And so it was always about, hey, New Zealanders can do things and we want them to do it. And I think he's got a lot of that. And I think lastly, there's a bit of a misconception that he's some sort of Bible-bashing moral crusader who's, opposed to, conservative on every issue and opposed to everything. And it's just not true. It's a great myth propagated by the left. But actually, when I was at Air New Zealand, he was a massive supporter of gay rights in the company. He was a huge supporter of women in the workforce and their rights in the workforce. I mean, look, he actually, I don't think you have to ask him, I don't think he's been to church for the last 5 years. Not that it's a good or bad thing, I mean, it's a personal choice, but he's definitely more conservative than me, but then I'm probably right out there at the liberal end of things. But is he a guy that wants to go out there and wind back rights from abortion to gay rights, as you see on the very right of politics in, say, the United States, where, what Trump's talking about and what a lot of those guys are talking about, he's a million miles away from that. So I personally think he'd be a great Prime Minister.
So you mentioned there that your government was kind of focused on being ambitious for New Zealanders. Was there sort of one issue that got you out of bed in the morning? For Jacinda Ardern, she says that it's trying to fix child poverty. Was there sort of one policy or one issue that you focused on? Yeah,
I mean, that was certainly one of them. It was really to say, can we get New Zealanders to believe, hey, we've got, we're this great little nation at the bottom of the earth. Yeah, we accept no one owes us a living, but we can be better, smarter, more successful. And that was why we did things like, and sort of time moves on, and my ex-chief of staff, I describe as my chief of staff for life, then elected Prime Minister of New Zealand, Wayne Eagleson, he reckons I should write a book, and his whole argument about me writing a book isn't so much clearly not to make money or anything, because they probably don't make money anyway, but it's really about a journal of records. So for instance, when we changed the law around the Hobbits movies and about the definition of a contractor, that was because I thought there are just a huge number of New Zealanders that work in the creative industries or want to work in the creative industries. I'd personally be absolutely hopeless at it. But our daughter is very interested in the arts and always been involved in that sort of stuff. But actually, I thought, well, they're not going to make the movies in New Zealand if we don't do it. It was one of the weird things where we actually had protesters protesting for us to change the law, so slightly unusual. But, so people might want to say, oh God, no one needs chairman of a bank, that's all the stuff he believes and it's all about money. It's not actually true. I mean, yeah, I want people to be wealthier, but I kind of can understand all sorts of different things that they might want to do. I hope Jacinda's number one thing isn't child poverty, because if it is, she's hopelessly failed. In every stat that I can see, it's got worse. And it does come back to political philosophy. Do you think that just throwing money at a problem via bureaucrats is going to work? Because if it is, can someone explain to me why the housing situation is worse, the homelessness situation is worse, the poverty situation is worse, the number of people at food banks is worse? I mean, it's been an unmitigated disaster for these people.
So do you think that Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern will leave the country in a worse place than she found it from the previous national government?
By definition, yes. If you look at all those stats, there isn't a single stat that's better. I can't think of a single stat. Name one. Suicide, whatever. Nothing is better. So yeah, I'm not saying she's not. Look, I actually quite like Jacinda. She came in 08. I knew her parents pretty well. I'm sure she's a really nice person, and I'm sure she is really well intentioned. I'm not arguing that. I'm sure she believes in the things that she says. Did she do a pretty good job in COVID? I think in the first round, yes. In the latter rounds, no. Did she do a good job of supporting people of Christchurch in New Zealand through the massacres? Absolutely she did. And is she a good communicator? I mean, I think she's going to have an amazing career on the world stage. I really do. I think that, she's very well liked internationally, and she'll do really, really well. I'm just saying, if you're asking me about whether I think any of those stats improved, it's not my personal view. My view doesn't matter. There isn't a stat she could come to us and say is better. They're all worse.
Employment?
Well, okay, yeah, we're at the real low margins of say 3% or whatever, but they've been tracking down. Yeah. They've been tracking down forever, and she's stopped immigration coming in to the country, and so what that's done is, okay, take Zespri. Zespri's income was down $400 million, which is, if you want to talk about trickle-down economics, a huge impact for communities in rural New Zealand, all because they can't get enough people to pick fruit, pack fruit, do anything. So the number of people on a benefit has risen in the time that she's been Prime Minister, but they want to argue unemployment's come down. Well, that's what happens when people leave and you don't let anyone come in.
Yeah, I think that's actually something like, I think Eve and I both agree on, like, personally, I think Christopher Luxon would be a great Prime Minister for New Zealand. I just happen to think Jacinda Ardern will be slightly better.
You should think that too, because if you don't, she's really in trouble.
I think they're both fantastic leaders, same as James Shaw and same as David Seymour. Christopher Luxon said climate change is a preeminent issue of our time. At what point did the National Party leadership decide that this was the biggest issue out there?
I don't think we ever said it was the single biggest issue. If we did, we'd be lying to you. I mean, we think it's a really important issue, and I thought it was an important issue over time, but I didn't think it was the biggest issue. I mean, when I came in, we had the GFC, we had the Christchurch earthquakes, we had so many issues to deal with. I mean, Bill did huge amounts of work as Minister of Finance and ultimately as Prime Minister around the drivers of social issues, and so all the work that you start seeing a little bit now, where for instance, if a child turns up at Child, Youth and Family when they're 8 years of age, we could then go back and trace back all the other precursors to that and what it looked like down the track. Are they likely to become pregnant if they're a female, or incarcerated, or drop out of school? So, but what I would say is, there was a discernible change. So when I came in 2002, the speaking notes for the National Party was that climate change was a hoax. And that was the right-wing view, I think, around the world largely in politics, was that climate change was the left-wing conspiracy. And so, the left used to get up when I was in Parliament and say, oh, John Key said climate change is a hoax. Absolutely true. I did say that. I read out the speaking notes, which I knew very little about, if I'm really honest. So I'd come out of a career in banking and not a career in things. So, I mean, you got me. But later on, though, what did happen was I started looking at, and, started being more curious, and you're more exposed, if I'm honest. And so I started looking at going, hey, I really do think anthropogenic climate change is real, and I do think it's happening, and I do think it's a massive problem. And Eve can probably tell you, because her father would have been at plenty of the things. So I used to go along, and the farmers were all opposed, right? They'd say, oh, this is all cost and it's terrible and blah, blah. And I used to get up and say, let's just argue for a moment I'm right and you're wrong. Let's just argue for a moment that climate change is happening. So, okay, name me a business that is more intergenerational than farming. I can't think of one. So many farms get passed down somewhere along the line, or kids of farmers ultimately go and buy another farm or whatever. So it's huge intergenerational, both wealth and risk, right? And so I used to say to them, let's say I am right and you are wrong, then you're going to be passing on to your children an asset that's going to get wiped out, because we are going to get these catastrophic weather patterns, and nothing's more exposed than agriculture, right? And so we started, and we bought the emissions trading scheme in New Zealand, which, when you look at things like Australia, they would say, wow, New Zealand was really forward leaning on all that sort of stuff. And I appointed a chief science advisor, the first prime minister, to do that. And we had Sir Peter Gluckman, and Gluckers went out, and I said to him, okay, I want you to go around the world and look at every scientist, every sort of body of research that you can see, and tell me the group of people that think climate change is a hoax and that isn't real. And the answer is, like anything in life, economists or scientists, you can always find someone who will believe that. But the massively overwhelming bulk of evidence is that climate change is happening, it's real, and it's a major problem. What you did get is you got a Bjorn Lomborg type person who would say, it's just not worth us fixing it. And I would certainly be of the view that would say technology would help us a lot. So I was in Germany a few weeks ago giving a speech, and the CEO of BMW was there, right? And they sell 2.5 million units a year there across Rolls-Royce, BMW and Mini. And he said less than 10% of them are electric. But he said they're rapidly going that way, and by 2030 they won't produce a Mini worldwide that's not electric. Now, you can actually argue the case around batteries and whether hydrogen is the way to go, and you can certainly argue a case about the source of the energy to power that car. But if you take New Zealand, where you late 80s and renewables on your way to 90 odd, no country's better probably than New Zealand, maybe other than Scandinavia, to have renewable cars. So I guess what I'd say to you is I believe in it, and I think we need to deal with it, and I think we have been dealing with it to a degree. I'm not saying everything's perfect. We've got a really weird makeup, like we have an emerging country makeup, because half our emissions are from agriculture, and there isn't easy answers here. But I can't sit here and tell you that I said it was the number one thing for our government, because I didn't say that.
What about today? Do you agree or disagree with Chris Luxon today that it's the preeminent issue of our time?
I think they would argue that because they would say that if you look at the sort of intergenerational systemic issues, they would probably say that's the case. I'd have it there as like a really important thing to deal with, but it's a funny thing when you're Prime Minister, it's a bit like running a company. I mean, you have many competing interests and forces and a constituency for every dollar you spend. But let's go and take, you were making the point about, not well off New Zealanders earlier in their tax rates. And I could argue with you about whether you can cook the books on effective marginal tax rates. But what we can't argue is, are there a huge number of New Zealanders who are earning not enough to have the standard of living and the care that they need for their family? I think we can all agree on that. And so I guess I'd say to you, if I was back being Prime Minister tomorrow, would my biggest issue be trying to say help them versus think, I don't know. These things are all challenges. You just have many of them as well, I'm saying.
So I guess changing tech away from the environment. So you're probably more familiar with China. Probably one of your favourite topics to talk about. So obviously,
cool, I can be on my own on this one. Worldwide, just about.
Yeah, so I've actually got a few flatmates who are definitely who do international relations and are very concerned with the relationship New Zealand has with China. Yeah. How do you think Labour are going about managing that relationship? And I guess given where China is today versus when you were in government, would you have managed it any differently? Or?
Well, it certainly changed a lot. Okay, so if you real quick sort of history, I suppose, well, I would see the world. If you go to 2008 when I became Prime Minister, there was a view around the world that was China is going to emerge as a superpower, going to be this big big player in the world, and if we embrace them, the things that we quote unquote don't like, they'll eventually ameliorate that behaviour and become more like us, right? That was basically, and some would argue, well, Obama and TPP was more about containment of them. I'd actually argue with you, if you don't have leadership in a particular part of the world, then others will show that leadership, and you choose, whether you want to be there or not. You can't do everything, but actually being part of Asia, it's really important that America's there. So what's happened is, roll the clock forward a bit, Donald Trump changed the global narrative on China. He basically just said to the people of Detroit and all the rest of it that lost their job, well, there's got to be a reason you lost your job, and it isn't anything that we've done. So therefore, these people don't play fairly. They pay people a bowl of rice a day. They don't have labour laws. They steal intellectual property, all this sort of stuff. And so, and the world accepted that version of events, and then also started saying they're not going to become like us. And so nowadays, it's vastly different. So, I went to a right-wing buddy group of former leaders the other day, and we were talking all about China. I was the only one that had anything half decent to say about them. Yeah, and these are people I like and who are smart. So why do I think different things to them? The answer is, firstly, I think they are going to emerge as a superpower, whether you like it or not. Secondly, I don't think they actually want to be like us. This is the weird thing. I think they've looked at the United States and they've said, we don't want a bar of your inequality, influence from social media, gun laws, all the moral issues you're going through. We don't actually think you're actually, got massive debts. We actually don't think you're doing that well. Do I think that they are improving in some areas? Yes. Is there more work to be done? Human rights, whatever? Yes. But I don't think you ever change another person's view just yelling at them. History tells you if you do that enough in a marriage, it's called divorce. Actually, you don't resolve the issue. You just go your separate ways. So actually, I kind of always been a bit of the view you can like if you sit down with your best friend and maybe you see her or him doing something that you don't think is cool, and you just over time try and change that, you might get there, right? And you tend to do that when you sort of, soft hands and, carry a big stick type of thing. Where the world differs, where I differ from most other people is, in the US, they have created a vision, and because I tell you what, it's universal, both sides of politics, doesn't matter, the only thing they can agree on, stronger the rhetoric, anti-China rhetoric, the better. So where we differ is, a lot of people think they're going to invade and attack and become a military force, and I don't think that's true. What I do think is they'll never let go of their territorial authority in Taiwan, Hong Kong, Tibet, whatever. But they're not. Are they going to get up tomorrow and attack anyone? The answer is no. Whereas some Americans believe that they're going to go on the offensive, and they're just going to get wealthier and bigger, and we're going to let them do all this stuff, and then one day they're going to be really big and they're going to come and invade.
Do you reckon we're overexposed economically to them?
We're very exposed to them, but I mean, even I used to get up and say, don't have all your eggs in the Chinese basket, and I like them. I went 7 times as Prime Minister, and I thought they were good. What I'd say is we've had that situation when Britain was our big market and we were their little farm in the South Pacific, and then one day we woke up and oops, they were in part of the European common market and we had no one to sell stuff to. So I think the more we can sell things to a broader array, the better. But here's your problem, isn't it? Is that take Zespri. Okay, this year they'll make 3.6 billion. About $1 billion, a little under that, 900 million of that product will get sold to China. Why? Because they want to buy, what used to be Chinese gooseberries in a former life. They want to buy that product. They like it. They like clean food from New Zealand. They really value that. And their issue is that they pay a high premium for it. So do we tell a Zespri grower, or do we tell someone who has crayfish quota out of the Chathams or whatever, don't sell it there, sell it for less somewhere else? What I'd say to you is I probably would sell it to China, but accept that, yep, the relationship could really deteriorate and access to that market might get limited, as it did for Australia. Is Jacinda doing a good job? Look, I think it's tough. In my day, because we were all a bit more unified in the view that we wanted China, it was easier. Today, it's increasing. You can see the United States is leading the charge of you're either not completely with us or against us, but they're certainly trying to argue that case more loudly. And they think New Zealand's not saying enough anti-China rhetoric. And so it's hard because she's trying to balance what's a big trading partner with our traditional allies. I think, to be fair to her, it's not easy.
People like Trump, Bolsonaro and Putin, how do you balance your personal views with the need for civil diplomacy when it comes to the big international actors like that?
Yeah, well, I think you've got to say we have relationships with countries, that are enduring. I mean, obviously with Russia, the relationship's far less than, say, our relationship with the United States. And that's what I would say to people when they say, oh, we don't like what the Chinese do in human rights. I'd say, well, okay, we raise the issue with them all the time, but we also don't like the death penalty in the United States. And I happen to agree with, the Supreme Court's view of Roe v. Wade, all that sort of stuff, I mean, so there's just a whole lot of things. So you do have to try and put that to one side. And I think, honestly, Prime Ministers are generally pretty good at that. They sort of accept, like, I went through 5 Australian Prime Ministers. Some I liked more than others. If you have a really good relationship, does it help? I think the answer is yeah, it helps. But then some people like Putin, even if you could have a good relationship with them, would you want one? I personally wouldn't. I always found him thoroughly objectionable and not a nice person, whereas Xi Jinping I actually genuinely liked and found him to be quite engaging. And neither of them speak English theoretically, although if Putin doesn't speak English, I'll probably eat this table because he's an ex-KGB agent, but he claims he doesn't.
Were there any world leaders that you particularly enjoyed the company of during your time as Prime Minister?
This might sound like the right thing to say at this particular time, but the Queen was a remarkable person. It's all the things that you sort of see written about her that she just had a vastness of experience and things she'd seen it was just like fascinating talking to her. And she was quite open, like she would, like when we went to Balmoral, we had lots of time together, really like the other times I met her, and she just happily sort of, I think she trusted her Prime Ministers that you wouldn't breach that confidence. I mean, there's things you can say and things you can't say. And she said lots of things to me about different people and different things that I would never repeat, probably never ever told anyone, never would. But on the other side of the coin, there are some things you can say, obviously. Obama was sort of, like a hugely fascinating guy. I mean, I like Barack. He's a bit of an academic. He's kind of got that retail side of things, a bit academic. I really like Bill Clinton, funnily enough, actually. I think Clinton, if you put the Monica Lewinsky thing to one side, small little blip in the road, he's probably going to go down, I reckon, as he won't because of that, maybe, and because there's just such a hatred of each other's side, which we unfortunately getting a little more of that in New Zealand, which is not that healthy. Like I might have a really strong view that Chris would be a better Prime Minister, National would be a better government, but I hate the Labour Party. I don't hate Jacinda at all. As I said earlier, I quite like her actually. I just have a different philosophical view. Theirs is way extreme, but the history should treat Clinton well. Like he balanced the books, he grew the economy, he was uber smart guy. He did a lot of great things, and so I liked him. Merkel I liked. I think history might treat her not so well the other way because getting rid of nuclear power and now the reliance on Russian gas and stuff. But yeah, so there were a whole bunch of them that they were good.
You and Obama spent a bit of time on a golf course. Who was better?
Well, it would be wrong of me to say, but I was. So he's a left-hander. He plays off about 11, actually, although she's the one I'm playing at the moment. I might be off 11 very soon. So anyway, but it's good. He, unlike some US presidents, he actually knows the rules of the game, sticks to them. He's a very funny guy. But, there's an interesting world actually when you're President of the United States of America. It's largely, a foreign policy job. They spend a huge amount of time looking at Ukraine and Russia, looking at the Middle East, looking at, all sorts of issues. I would have spent more nights out of my home as Prime Minister than he did as President of the United States of America. Largely, he was at home most nights. He went home for dinner between 5:30 and 6:30. said goodnight to the kids. I mean, it's not that he didn't work. He went back to the White House and went to his office, and and the pressure and the responsibilities, and it's everything in scale. But they don't go and cut ribbons like we do. They don't go and open things. They do fundraisers, but it's a different level. It's different actually. It's kind of different job.
The flag referendum, I'm gutted it didn't happen. Is there anything else like that you really wanted to get through and didn't?
Yeah, it was a bit of a shame on the flag. The blunt reality was Labor and the Greens' policy was to change the flag, and the reason that they didn't do it was that they thought in the end, if I lost the referendum, it would hurt me. Right. And that's the game. It's called politics. It's what you do, and would we do the same thing to Jacinda tomorrow if we could? Probably. But the tragedy of it was it would have been great for New Zealand. Just because I think that I'm actually a monarchist, so I don't want New Zealand to be a republic and all that stuff. But I just think that, like, you live in Melbourne, if you want to walk down the street tomorrow and you want to show people that you're proudly a New Zealander, you'll probably put a silver fern on your thing. You won't put the flag. Well, Australians actually use their flag a bit more than we do, you probably notice, but the reality is it'd be hard to differentiate for people. I have said publicly recently, but it's true, I put on a bit of a rearguard action. Shouldn't have been a rearguard action because I was actually leading the joint, so maybe it should have been a front guard action, but to do a massive cancer facility in New Zealand. So I wanted to spend a lot of money and really build out a kind of, I don't know, Mayo Clinic, MD Anderson, that Sloan Kettering type of thing in New Zealand. And what the general view across health and a number of other parts was, we already have those things. And I would say to you, like, for instance, that's not true. I've got a friend, for instance, who for a very long time had to go to Melbourne to get transfusion for a very, very rare type of pancreatic cancer. We don't have enough. We haven't had access to all the drugs, for instance, and we haven't. And you go through all these things, and what you learn in life. I'm 61 now, right? And what you learn when you get older is the things that you worry about when you're 21 are not the things that you necessarily worry about when you're 61. And that's good actually, because by the way, you want to have all these things you worry about when you're 21. But when you eventually, as you get older in life, you sit back and say, I really care about whether my family is healthy and happy, whether I'm healthy. Those sort of things become more important. And we just had a sort of family member who died of cancer, and we did a lot to try and save him. And we had the capacity to do that both financially and probably through access. But actually it was really hopeless. We did the best we could. We probably got them another year, but actually, why is it that we can do that and vast bulk of New Zealanders couldn't have done that? They couldn't have rung up people and said, will you operate on them tomorrow? Will you, couldn't have funded the drugs that we funded. And I just look at that and go, well, it's just such a horrible thing that people go through. So I think there's just so much more in that space we could have done, I suppose. And that includes, for instance, even more money and energy into hospice and things where, none of us are going to live forever, but, just better stuff.
Do you have something you're most proud of as Prime Minister? Or one achievement you think that you really kind of got over the line that's made a difference for New Zealanders?
Well, Antonians might say Transmission Gully today because it's snowing down there. Look, I think ultimately, the way we stuck with Christchurch and the economic stuff around the GFC, we balanced the books. And yesterday they came out and said, well, the deficit's only going to be nearly 10 billion, because corporates are paying more tax. Well, someone's got to pay for that. Do you know what the average duration of the debt that Labor's borrowed in the last while? It's 7 years. It's 7.1 years, okay? So, in 7.1 years, I don't know what interest rate's going to be. The answer is more than the other day, probably. And it wasn't that long ago in New Zealand's history where the Minister of Finance's budget was paying the interest bill. And then, then it was health and education. So every dollar you're spending on that, you're not spending on other things. Now, people would say, oh, well, that's very cute, but, what about all the people that would have starved to death and all the issues with COVID, if you hadn't spent money? And I'm not arguing that we shouldn't have done that. That playbook, by the way, was just copied from us in the Christchurch earthquakes, where you pay people money. You had to do all that sort of stuff. But the level of expenditure and sort of wasteful stuff and the just throwing money everywhere. I mean, look, this government can't even give money away. I mean, that's got to be the ultimate definition of how hopeless you are when you're giving it to dead people and cats. I mean, honestly.
I think even I largely agree with you on, a lot of our friends are just starting their YoPro career out working in the consultancies, and, we've both got, I guess, criticisms of the efficacy of some of these consultancies, particularly in relation to government spending. But I guess on government spending, slightly changing lanes, Australia funded a lot of sports. You're a big supporter of the All Blacks while you're in government.
Yeah.
Typically, right-wing government, you think limited to government, let's not spend any funding on sports. Is that an opinion you differ with?
Well, we did spend more money. I mean, we put a lot more money into high-performance sport. And I saw Mike Stanley, he's just retiring as the head of the Olympic Committee, saying, basically saying, well, isn't it incredible how well we've done over the last, 20 odd years or 10, 15 years. And I think that is a function of resources, money, training facilities, support of athletes, all that sort of stuff. So we definitely put a lot more money in sport. I mean, on a relative basis, it's tiny budgets relative to, say, health and education, so it should be. But we did put in more. Australia, I think Australia does some of that. So I think Australia does some things really well. I really do. I think Australia sees itself as a middle power. It's just everything it does. It's why it's a part of AUKUS is its defence relationships now, and it's why it thinks New Zealand's little and soft and doesn't really pull its weight. And I mean, knowing they like us and everything, don't get me wrong, but they want Australia to win, and they don't need to change their flag because they would say, we'll just whack the Aussie flag up and people will understand that one, and whereas we sort of don't. And all I'm saying to you is, I think when you build any society, it's not just as simple as I put money into this thing. It's like, why do some people make it in life and some people don't make it in life? Because some people come from terrible backgrounds and the least likely that they'll succeed, yet they go on and succeed. It's their fundamentally basic self-belief and work ethic, right? And so I'm in the camp of the world that says, okay, throwing money at things is interesting, but actually sometimes it can create the wrong outcomes and the wrong incentives and the wrong behaviour. That doesn't mean you don't provide support for people, but when they brought in welfare in New Zealand, Michael Joseph Savage brought it in, he always said it wouldn't be an armchair ride to prosperity. And we used to talk a lot about it when we were at work. And one of the things I was Prime Minister, I used to say, like, you judge a society by how they look after the sick and the vulnerable. But you also judge a society by how many sick and vulnerable they create. And, are we doing that? Like, are we creating, the environment where, and give you an example. I mean, you go back to the employment thing you said earlier, which is right. So unemployment's really, really low. But, it's something like 465,000 people on benefit. And when you go to an employer in an unvarnished environment and say, okay, well, what about all these people in Dole? I mean, you guys are telling us you can't get workers. We'll go and hire some of these people. You go and genuinely ask them. They'll tell you. They turn up for 2 or 3 days, and then they can work out exactly where the benefit intersection is, or they won't stay, or And so you sit there and you go, but the amount of money they're getting is miserable. Like, it's low. So why are they doing that? And the answer, I can't give you a sound answer for that. What I can tell you though is that they are. So we put in lots of things like that labour of reverse, but we did put in, work testing, and we did put in that you can't get more benefit if you have more children on the DPB equivalent and all that sort of stuff. Now, you can argue, that's wrong, but I would argue with you, a welfare system is based on mutual obligation. There's an obligation on government to pay it, but there really is an obligation on the individual to try and get off it.
I guess probably
if they can.
I guess to finish up, your time as Prime Minister of New Zealand ended quite abruptly.
It did. Yeah. Well, they always do. They always do.
And to surprise a lot of people. Was there sort of one moment that you sort of said, I've had enough of this?
Look, the funny thing was, and this is a terrible thing to say, I didn't resign because I thought I was going to lose, or in part I resigned because I thought I was going to win. honestly thought the National Party was going to win, and we would do a fourth term, and I thought the entire fourth term would be dominated by when was I leaving. And so I just sat there and said, well, I think Bill's going to be a fantastic Prime Minister. I think if we're going to win, we actually have to rejuvenate. Because what happens is people get sick of you. You've actually been there for a while. I mean, yeah, I was doing something for ANZ the other. By the way, I never read social media comments. So if anyone wants to go out there posting wildly on anything I've got, knock your socks off, but I'll never see it, so you're not hurting me. And I deliberately did that, took that view, because there's just trolls out there, and it won't matter what side of the argument you're on, that they don't like you. But funnily enough, I must get Reddit or something, must get directed to my thing. I went out to do something for ANZ the other day, and some guy said, I walked past John Key, and he was at the Westfield malls, and I can't think of anyone I hate more, and I wish he'd, bloody meteorite and killed the guy, and all this sort of stuff, And so my point is just that, after a while, maybe he started life there as well, but after a while, more and more people just go, oh God, I'm so over this guy and the mannerisms and the things he does or whatever he says. Like they say about Jacinda, like they said about every Prime Minister that's been there a long time. So I just thought, well, we need to regenerate, and we had lots of talent and you had to bring it through. And I kind of think Prime Ministers in the end always stay too long and speak too long. And if you look at, say, John Howard, who I would rank as the greatest Australasian Prime Minister in a lifetime, really believed in the Aussie battler, but, right wing, knew how to win elections, all that sort of stuff. In the end, he lost Bennelong. He lost Bennelong, which is the safest, pretty much safest Aussie seat. So why would that happen? Because in the end, it was just one election too many. And I think, in the end, he had a great deputy prime minister. They just couldn't agree to come to a thing. So there was never any pressure from Bill. There wasn't some cooked up conspiracy. I've heard all sorts of great rumours and this. But in the January of that year, I said to Brandon, look, probably it's going to be my last year. And all she said to me is, she said, look, I'm not a political activist, as you know, I'm a little national voter, that's all great. But we've been in this thing for 15 years now. So if you're ever going to come back, I don't want you to come back. So if you feel like you want to do 3 more years, and do it. But when you go, go. So that was sort of the view I took, and I had a great run when I was there and enjoyed it.
I often say that we miss you, so no chance of you coming back then?
No chance of you coming back. You don't need me anyway. It's good. But and it's one of the things I really worry about in US politics. They're all so old. I mean, get young people. Like, I like the fact Jacinda's young. I mean, Chris is a young guy. I mean, I actually think, Obama and I came in we're exactly the same age. We're basically 46. He's born on the 4th of August and I'm the 9th. So I actually think it's so pressurised. There's so much work and there's so much going on. And if you think about things like climate change, they're modern. Well, not really completely these days modern, but, you just want people that can change and adapt, because you have to change and adapt. And the older you get, the more stuck in your ways you get. So actually, I kind of like young leaders personally, youngish. But.
Last one from me. I think quite relevant because we're in a bank today. We're surrounded by banks. Let's say there's a CEO on $6 million a year. Yeah. I've got no problems with them being paid 100 times what a nurse on 60K a year is if they're contributing 100 times to society. What on earth? Do you think that's fair? And should there be billionaires?
Oh, well, there'll definitely be billionaires. And I think most people probably tell you they don't want to be. I would be if I could. I'm never going to get there, but I would be if I could. I mean, kind of some part of me thinks, oh, that's really cool. You can go and buy anything you really want. I don't know if it make me any happier. I've got everything I want, but do you know what I mean? Like, I think my mother always used to say to me, John, money doesn't bring happiness. And I used to go, sure as hell helps, So, I don't know, call me old fashioned, but, not having the luxury at one level, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you can have enough money at least to pay for all those, life's going to be good. And then moving up from there. But, so I don't care if people are billionaires. I mean, to me, it's that hopefully it's a result of the fact that they've done whatever it is that's remarkable, from taking risks to work and talent. Tiger Woods happens to be a billionaire, but he's just a remarkable golfer, and there's musicians have done that and artists have done that, but acceptably more business people. I think your fundamental questions, because it's very hard to assess value and all of that sort of stuff. Simple facts of life are: should we pay nurses more? Answer: yes. And so, the question...
Or should we pay CEOs less?
Yeah, well, the question becomes, if we pay a CEO less, does it actually mean that we pay nurses more? And the answer there is no. Because actually what would end up happening is we wouldn't pay any more tax if we did that. So I think it's, it just sort of is what it is. Some people sit there and go, I absolutely want to be at the top of the pile and be a CEO. And other people sit there and go, I want to be a nurse. And we're pretty lucky that we have people that want to be nurses because we're all going to need them one day, at some point, probably many days.
Cool. Sir John, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks
really
a lot.
appreciate it.
Okay.
Cool.
Thank you very much.